So there's a lot of effort to eventually, in my eyes and some of my colleagues' eyes, to disrupt and get rid of the tuition waiver. And I think there's all the motivation and obligation for indigenous Native American students to stand up against that. And another thing I want to introduce or share is that as a minority Asian American and APIA, Asian American Islander Americans, some of us suffer from the model minority myth,
right?
Which is also by design. In my understanding is that during the 60s, when they introduced this in Newsweek, first in 1961, first the Japanese Americans, and then expanded the category to Chinese Americans and Koreans and so on and so forth. It's basically my translation is tell the American Indians and African Americans and the rest Chicanos to shut the F up. Look at these quiet, hardworking yellow people, Asian Americans, and then if you work just as hard and don't protest, you'll get to where they are.
And it also distills our purpose in this society as being completely driven by the accumulation of wealth.
Right.
And so, but what we have to understand that in the process of accumulating wealth, there's aspects of our identity that we have to slough off in order to fit in spaces where wealth can be garnered, right? When we think about, head wraps in schools being banned, or there's certain language you can use. Pot can't be used as canon in curriculum. There's aspects in terms of subjecting myself to school in order to get to a trajectory of professional ladders that are existentially violent, right? Ontologically as well as epistemologically, right? Me knowing my history, but me knowing myself. And in that homogenization, people don't realize that the accumulation of wealth was built on white supremacy, that capitalism and white supremacy are not the same thing. It is not a class versus race issue. Those two things are inextricably linked. And so the model minority myth is also, to your point, this issue of having to silence oneself, which if you've done that for 1,300 years of chattel anti-blackness, it wears on people spiritually, and hence the mistrust of schools.
If I could just add this final point is that what's even more damaging is it decreased the possibility of Asian Americans to collaborate and to form cross-cutting alliance with other minorities.
Right, the Hmong community, right. Cambodian, exactly. Thai, Laotian, Filipinos, Vietnamese.
I just wanted to say something really quickly. So this is kind of to your point, and you kind of answered my question, but personally, how do the both of you deal with that idea of having to work in the system to change the system? So for example, we're talking about this was a boarding school, this was land that was occupied primarily by natives before white people came over. And then Chad was saying, well, there's this duty, this legal obligation based on the conveyance and the condition in the lease that says you can have this land as long as you can.
Because white people have been so good with their treaties.
So so how do you, and here's me, like, I'm an attorney, I work within the law, right? I can change it in like little tiny steps, but every friggin' Supreme Court opinion is like, we are going to decide what we want to do, and we're just going to use this tiny little piece of jargon. I don't know if you read the appellate court decision regarding dreadlocks and how it's not considered discrimination because it's not an immutable characteristic of somebody, right? So like that, using people in the system using the legality of trying to just take this one word and say it all turns on this. So as an attorney, I struggle with that because I want to just say, well, yes, I want to keep that tuition waiver for Native Americans to give the opportunity for people who have been systematically oppressed to come to school when they can't afford it generally, but at the same time, why is there a trust relationship here, right? So I was doing a probate, like a clinic with some people in the community, and we got sidetracked, and I spent like 45 minutes explaining that that the government views Native reservations as beneficiaries, that they hold a trust, and so they're trustee, they're deciding what's good and what's best for you, right? And like, how do you dismantle that? while still being in it? How do you deal with that?
I feel you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That was the most, so I will continue to revisit the issue of the curriculum design. I will continue to go back to it because what happens in Louisville, I had no idea had like big city urban issues. I had no idea. Like I took a visit, but I wasn't offered a glimpse into what actually happens in Louisville, right? So it's an open campus. Many of our like buildings are in like close proximity to like poor and working class communities around Louisville. One of the first things I heard when I got to Louisville was, don't go past 9th Street. And I've never been to Louisville. I didn't know what 9th Street meant, but I knew exactly what that language was meaning to go. So
It's the opposite in Boston, by the
What
way.
is-
They
what
tell
is-
you not to go to South Boston if you're brown. So one
Oh,
instance
right.
instance of the white neighborhood being a little scary for the brown people.
Right,
So the
right.
opposite, right?
So, but in Louisville, it meant life and living people who have a conscience, people who have a strong work ethic, live on 8th and above. The minute that you go past 9th, you enter a zone of inhumanity. And so what we're doing is we're trying to entice students of color to come into our school counseling program. But representation means nothing if they're being socialized and indoctrinated into a curriculum that says, and I said yesterday, that you can go into the intro of school counseling, the textbook, and there's no mention of school desegregation. There's no problematization of education, or education as part of a larger systemic issue, right? So my concern, and the thing that I'm always trying to navigate is, what does representation and increasing the representation of students of color in our program mean when they're being indoctrinated with the same curriculum? That doesn't equip them to think about the school in a way that helps to undermine what it accomplishes in West Louisville, right? So that's the issue that I'm always trying to navigate is, well, what do we do when we get these students on campus, right? Are the necessary resources in place? Are we fostering the types of dialogue that help them to be the change agents that we implore them to be? If not, then what are we attempting to accomplish? We just want that representation to be able to put on flyers and not be able to make a viable contribution to the change that we purport that we're committed to. So that's the sort of hypocritical space that I'm trying to negotiate and oftentimes reconcile impossibly.
I would echo everything Dr. Washington said, and just in a nutshell, being candid with my students about my own complexity. Like, one of the first things I say on my first day of class for both the classes I'm teaching this year is, like, y'all, like, I know how hypocritical it can be for me to be in this space. So part of this trust that we're building is for us to reevaluate and unlearn our positionality. And I can't expect you to do it if I'm not modeling it myself. So really, it requires me to like have to wean myself away from some of that privilege, that academic privilege, and say like, I didn't learn about some of this stuff until well after I got my master's or my doctorate. And like I would have to take curriculum home to my mom and be like, look what they're having us do. My mom's like, what? So like that does affirm, especially for my students of color, that does affirm some of the same feelings that they're having about their curriculum, and the feelings they probably had about the curriculum since kindergarten. So, but yeah, I would say that it's important to have that dialogue, that unalloyed dialogue, but also it can't just be us expecting it of them. It needs to be from ourselves, like you're saying, as a lawyer, for us as professors, as counselors, as teachers. So, yeah.
I know Anthony gave us the 5 more minutes. Alert.
So we got 5 minutes. Other questions, comments? Rafa, how you feeling, bro?
Mind blown. This is dope.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
I have like stuff I can show y'all, like videos and stuff.
Yes.
If you guys want to keep chopping it up, we can.
Are y'all trying to push for the change of y'all's curriculum to better, or yeah, what's the actions that are going on to that?
And it also depends
Is
what
that-
you see as curriculum. I see everything as curriculum as
Yeah.
a teacher ed professor. I see everything as curriculum.
Yeah,
I
but
see
like as
class
the
setup
main
as
curriculum course that
Well,
that's
I know-
at your college?
How do you feel about standards?
Yeah.
Right, like
Oh, God.
standardized.
You might as well ask me Big Bang Theory, summarize in 3 words or less, go. Like, that's a dissertation.
I know there will come a time in 2020 where if you have a counseling program, you will not be able to exist without KCREP
Oh, yeah, the
accreditation.
K-Crep.
Without what?
KCREP, that's our national accrediting body.
Oh, okay.
That essentially stipulates what the curriculum has to look like. So,
This is here.
so it's that system that I have to take into account. So as much change as I want to make on campus, it's like, well, don't forget 2020, right?
Oh, what you were sharing with Rafa and I about your student, like about how she's pushing Pitt.
Oh, yeah,
That's a
yeah,
really good
yeah.
example.
So I have a student who graduated in May, and she successfully found a position in JCPS, which is extremely hard to do. And within months of being on the
Woman of
job,
color.
yeah, politics and the bureaucracy of JCPS is just disgusting. So, but she's been working for about, school's been in a couple of months, and she's already disgusted with the lack of student interaction. So she's a school counselor, and she's essentially she's been resigned to being like a glorified administrative assistant. So she doesn't have interactions with students, she doesn't have the opportunity to do classroom guidance, she doesn't have the opportunity to do group counseling.
Healing.
Yeah, essentially. The purpose of our profession, she's being prevented from engaging students in that way. But the curriculum says like we're going to go from 48 to 60 hours, but that extension, the expansion of those 12 hours is not to provide them with an additional multicultural class or to give them options outside of the traditional counseling canon, which is heavily informed by psychology and anthropology. So they won't get those courses. They will be extended the opportunities to do more clinical to do more clinical practice work inside the community or in a school, right? So it still doesn't provide the prerequisite information to think critically about their relationship to schools and how schools have historically had different relationships with communities of color and privileged and economically advanced white communities. Like that's the part that's most frustrating. Here, we'll give you an additional 12 hours, but we won't allow you to take those over in ethics studies. They have to be right here doing clinical work in these institutions.
And the other piece to that is this idea, and it just jarred my memory from something Dr. Washington said at the end, is this idea that people from in higher, more advanced courses, rigorous courses, I'm using that summarily, but like what Mick Jenkins was saying in Chicago, like I can be in an advanced honors course and my counselors will look at me as, well, he doesn't need any clinical help. He's not being traumatized. That model minority myth that Chad was talking about, like he's in the AP class. Why does a black kid who made it to the AP class need counseling? Because it's traumatizing to be in that class, in that situation with all white kids in a curriculum that's like European this, European that, and glorifying plantation owners, right? And so that's trauma. And so this idea that the accumulation of wealth, just like the accumulation of credit, is emblematic of success and not dehumanization, is something that's hard to uplift when that's the whole point of our work, is getting students in those spaces, but also realizing that those spaces in and of themselves are inherently violent.
Right.
And the accolades come to us when we prove effective in putting students of color in those spaces.
Which is how the guilt that I feel, like I struggle with it. I struggle when I see like iterations of restorative justice that are heavily microsystemic, that we're trying to restore kids, we're not trying to restore systems. Well, then there's a pretense that the kids are in need of restoration. And then what ends up happening is the school gets to cook their statistics and they report to the Office of Civil Rights as, we're not suspending the black boys anymore disproportionately, but they're getting referred to restorative justice mediation disproportionately. The school doesn't have to report that anymore to the federal government. The federal government can take a sip of that Flint water and say, look, it's clean now, right? And not realize that the plumbing is still faulty because you're still taking a deficit lens and framing these kids as in need of restoration.
Yeah, and not giving them anything to relate to. You know what I'm saying? Like bringing it back to like the whole hip hop thing. I think people have this idea of like, you know, hip hop is bad, right? It's bad for kids to be listening to hip hop. You know, they objectify women, they do all these really bad things, right? But it's like, we're not changing the situation. Like, this is their real truths. This is their everyday shit that they're going through, and we're not taking that in. You know what I mean? We're just like, oh, they're listening to all these cuss words and guns and all this shit, but that's their reality. You know, so how do we, man, exactly. So it's like, how do we come together and change the reality? How do we change the curriculum? How do we do that because I feel so helpless sometimes, you know what I'm saying? And as somebody who, I grew up kind of weird, you know. I had family members from all races, you know, and I think that I have this, people mistake me as white people mistake me as white people, and so I think that's kind of an advantage for me, because on a lot of times, you know, when awkward conversations come up, it's like, well, let me drop this shit on you because you don't actually know what you're talking about, you know. And I think it's just very frustrating for me to be able to see all of this shit that's going on and feel so helpless. Like, I really don't know what to do, you know.
When you talked about like the misogyny and the patriarchy and the objectification of women, the thing that I acknowledge those things happen in hip hop, and then I'm also asking, like, was it only happening in hip hop?
I mean, Elvis
Right,
beat
right,
Priscilla.
right.
It was everywhere.
And I'm
It's
like,
in every type of genre, every type of.
and in particular, like, again, South Carolina. In South Carolina, if you go and get your vital records, it's called the Sims building.
Right.
So Sims was instrumental in the discipline of gynecology. And if you know anything about how that discipline emerged, all of his insights were derived from the most profane, the most grotesque, the most against black women and girls, enslaved black women and girls without anesthesia. So if we're talking about objectification of women, then I don't necessarily have to pull up I don't have to turn to my radio. I can go to the Vital Records building in South Carolina, or on campus at the University of South Carolina, where there are buildings emblazoned with his name on them. So I think hip hop is a platform to highlight the contradictions and to literally call bullshit. That's for me more than anything else. It's saying you want to convince me that hip hop culture exemplifies and embodies all these nefarious things that we're supposedly trying to eliminate. But there are myriad examples. I can't go to a football game. You're talking about objectification of women, and I can go to a basketball game on a college campus and there are women there for the sole purpose of enticing older male patrons. Like, come on now. And I think that's what hip hop has to be, where students can speak, and I use this word intentionally. I've heard from Fred Wilson, Afro-pessimist, speak irresponsibly without thinking about recourse or repercussion. And it gives you life, it's life affirming, because you know you're not the embodiment of evil that society tries to make you believe that you are.
We had the same thing at Stanford. Terman, who was one of the creators of the SAT, he's the engineering building at Stanford, one of the top engineering schools in the country, is named after Donald Terman. And Terman was famous for saying the SAT is the best way after integration to keep black and indigenous folks out of school, because we'll create a test where if I said, Rafa, do you sleep on a bed, a couch, a floor, a sidewalk, a car, a yacht, right? And on the SAT, they don't say pick the right answer. What do they say?
Best answer.
Pick the best answer, according to whom? So if he may check bed, knowing good and well 25% of my students in East Oakland are foster youth and homeless. How many of them have seen a yacht outside of a T-Pain video, right? Yacht or floor is the correct answer. Car is the correct answer. I know April, one of my students in Oakland, she just got into UC Santa Cruz. That was the first time she said, Dr. D, this is the first time I ever had a bed, was in the dorms. All through her life, she slept in her mom's car. So she has to check bed in order to acquiesce to this notion of success. Which brings us back to Frank Wilderson's idea of the consumption of blackness is really a way to homogenize whiteness as the benchmark.
I'm not going to stop this conversation for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to add somebody into this conversation that is a friend of all of ours.
Don, yes.
But what we're going to do is nobody's going to move except we're going to move 2 tables in so we can be more inclusive to the space. Because what we're having is not an intellectual academic conversation. We're having a movement building conversation. And so I don't want to stop that. And then there's another not
He's
panel.
dope. Y'all want to stay. Don is dope.
So there's not another panel going on. And Don and I, we're going to talk about a chapter that we're doing. I'll talk a little bit about it. Don's going to talk about a blackface incident that just happened 2 days ago at his college that he's dealing with, and that how the school to prison pipeline, which we all deal with, and hip hop, the school to prison pipeline is not something that is just in K to 12 or pre-K to 12, but it's also in higher education. And so he'll be talking about how push out occurs in higher ed. So don't move, or certain people, let's like move these 2 tables out of the way and then get some more people in, and then let's make this a little bit more tight.